We're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years. Now it's time for a new chapter to open, and I wish John Major all the luck in the world.
I first thought John Major would have become Prime Minister. She delivered office to him.
That was part of the trouble for the Conservative Party in the years to come. She saw John Major as her protégé, but when he didn't turn out to be a true Thatcherite, she felt another burning sense of betrayal.
When you lose a job like that, it's very similar to having a bereavement, and you do feel it's a great loose end, and it does have an effect on you. It was very sad, and of course a lot of her close friends were very bitter about this. It affected their thinking for years to come.
It was a very difficult period of time. I can remember it particularly because one of the big issues was Christmas. We had always spent Christmas Day at Chequers. There was a group of us that were always invited. And Alistair tried to recreate that the Christmas after she'd resigned. And we had a Christmas Day celebration at the Dorchester, and it was just a disaster. Hadn't got things to talk about. We weren't running the country anymore. We weren't discussing those kind of issues. We were just, going through a sort of make-believe, which didn't work because we weren't in Chequers.
She really existed to work. One could perhaps rephrase Descartes and say, I work, therefore I am. I mean, her whole life was work. Now, of course, some of her energy went into starting on her memoirs, some of it went into speeches and international visits, but she couldn't keep quiet. It was quite unnatural. And one has to say that she had a right to be heard. People criticise her for speaking up and sometimes contradicting the government of the day. But she hadn't been defeated in an election. No, she had been shoved unceremoniously out of office by her immediate parliamentary colleagues. And the last thing in the world she was ever going to do was to shut up.
She had made that famous comment about being a backseat driver at Central Office when she left. She meant it completely sincerely. She couldn't understand why her successors saw her as such a threat. She thought they ought to have seen her as a helpful influence.
We had that dreadful period at first when she publicly announced that she wanted to be a backseat driver, which not surprisingly greatly annoyed John Major.
It was sensible to keep her posted, otherwise she might lash out with some ill-judged remark or criticism, not particularly because she wanted to do any damage, but in a very delicate situation one had to be careful.
Goes to the cabinet table. She was a voice on the telephone. Can I come and see you, Douglas? And of course she could come and see you. And several times as Foreign Secretary, one became exposed to it. I mean, she was acting entirely within her rights. I was never conscious of any sort of intriguing. I was conscious of outright assault.
As far as she was concerned, America was a foreign country. It would take some months for the news to get back to London. That was how her instincts were. And when you're overseas, you can say things that you can't say when you're at home, that in some way that's not as offensive.
In a series of American interviews, she went on the record with her view that John Major was dismantling her inheritance. She dismissed his government as the B team. This, despite claiming to be loyal.
The press sometimes excel themselves. I've been very quiet at home, which has been a very great effort. So they've taken to interpreting my silence.
But there were some things, she told her audience, that were too important to keep quiet about, most notably Europe.
I think that these decisions that have to be made in Europe are of enormous moment to the British people, the whole future of our Parliament, and the more openly that we discuss them and the more thoroughly we discuss them, the better. So I think perhaps a little less silence might be called for on my part.
She saw Europe as a serious threat to the independence of Britain. Given how strongly she felt about it, I would have found it amazing if she had swallowed her views and never said them. She felt very, very strongly about it. She really saw Britain's identity being lost in Europe.
I must say, my lords, I personally could never have signed this treaty. I hope that that is clear.
The Tory party was very disunited. Margaret became more and more disenchanted with John Major. He also became disenchanted with her. He got to the stage where he couldn't stand her.
For John Major, her worst offence as a former party leader was to actively encourage rebellion over such a fundamental piece of the government's programme as the Maastricht Treaty. For the Eurosceptic rebels, though, these were heady days. She would come and address the rebels at their so-called Maastricht pie parties near Westminster, where suitably English food was served.
There was a tremendous air of excitement because everybody knew that it was, in fact, an act of defiance. Immediately next to Westminster, she would speak, not for very long, then we get down to tucking into this extremely good steak and kidney pie. Insofar as there is a myth that's developed, I think generated by her political enemies, that somehow or other she was in a state of perpetual insurrection and was engaged in setting up meetings to undermine the government and the Prime Minister, I would say that was just simply not true.
She was actively urging people to vote against it, come what may. Didn't seem to mind if it brought the government down. What, of course, we were doing all the time was calculating how to address this, trying to work out how many people she persuaded to go into the lobbies with the Labour Party that we might otherwise rescue. When Margaret was in office, Ted just remained icily aloof, utterly but silently detached. He never went so far as to try to campaign against her. And to have one of your predecessors actively campaigning against you made it very, very difficult for John Major ever to assert any proper authority over the party.
She was never as disloyal to John as Heath was to her. Heath went into a long, prolonged sulk and would brief the press against her. Margaret, I don't think, ever briefed the press against John Major, but she made it clear in her strange way, and a rather effective way, that he was less of a favourite.
I was turned out because I said to Europe, no, no, no. That no, no, no is turned into yes, yes.
You can't go through life telling people not to say things they believe. You can't, I can't, John Major couldn't.
She embarked on a frantic programme of speaking engagements abroad. There, she often got the kind of adulation she used to get from the Conservative Party. As well as travelling abroad, she increasingly turned her attention to international affairs. In 1993, as Yugoslavia fell apart in an increasingly bloody civil war, she took up the cause of the Bosnian Muslims, favouring strong intervention to protect them from the Serbs. In private, she was said to have accused Douglas Hurd, the Foreign Secretary, of being an appeaser like Neville Chamberlain. Publicly, she was only slightly more restrained.
It'll give encouragement to every dictator, every would-be dictator, that the West has not the will to stand up for the innocent. The West will betray the innocent. It's a terrible thing.
She had a completely one-sided view of it. She didn't accept any complications. It was a simple matter of the Serbs were doing wicked things and they must be stopped by force.
I think she had more influence on American opinion, probably on this particular issue, than on British opinion. I think probably it got through in the end to President Clinton. The only way to bring this situation to a head was to use force, and when the bombing started, of course, the Serbs caved pretty rapidly.
It was America which provided her with her favourite platform. There she felt politically at home with free market Republicans.
Going to America after she was no longer Prime Minister was a great solace to Mrs. Thatcher because she still got the adulation that she obviously enjoyed, the large crowds, the fervent support, and giving a speech there evoked a reaction from the audience of enthusiasm and support, which she would not get in the United Kingdom.
In 1991, she was awarded the US Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bush Sr. in recognition of her support for America during the Gulf crisis.
She listened to my explanation, agreed with the decision, but then added these words of caution, words that guided me through the Gulf crisis. Remember, George, she said, this is no time to go wobbly.
Thank you, Mr. President, for the wonderful things you said, including that wobbly bit.
One reason she went so often to the States was to raise money for the Thatcher Foundation. She had started this shortly after leaving Downing Street to propagate her ideas, particularly in the emerging democracies of Eastern Europe. After an initial flurry of activity, it didn't make the impact she might have hoped, but it did help bring on a generation of politicians who understood capitalism. Her other big project, of course, was her autobiography, published in 2 parts in 1993 and 95, which she had originally wanted to call Undefeated. Every Prime Minister wants to put their version of history on the record, but inevitably publication caused more problems for John Major. In 1997, to neither his surprise nor hers, he lost the election to Tony Blair. Lady Thatcher was initially all geared up to support John Redwood as a true free-market Thatcherite, as Major's replacement as party leader. But then she heard that Redwood was making a compact with the Europhile incarnate Ken Clarke.
She couldn't believe John Redwood would do that. I spoke to her that morning. She said, no, John would never go into partnership with Ken. At 11 o'clock that morning it was announced that he hadn't. At 12 o'clock she was on the steps of the House of Commons with William Hague saying, he's my man.
I am supporting William Hague. Now, have you got the name? William Hague. Vote for William Hague, for principled government, following the same kind of government which I led, and vote for him on Thursday.
When William Hague himself was replaced as leader in 2001, she again intervened in the leadership contest, backing the Eurosceptic Ian Duncan Smith. But her influence at Westminster was waning outside the hard core of her Eurosceptic supporters. What she still had, though, was the power to embarrass her successors. The annual conferences were a nightmare for the party managers. Before the 2001 election, in an attempt to be helpful, she described her appearance at the conference as the mummy returns. But her health, once so vigorous she could work all night, was beginning to fade. As early as 2000, her daughter Carol said her mother was getting uncharacteristically confused. Some friends, like her advertising guru Maurice Saatchi, are upset by this characterisation of her mental state.
She was tired, weak. And certainly she would find it hard to sustain a long conversation, but not because her mind wasn't able to comprehend what was going on, but because she was tired.
In 2002, she reluctantly agreed to her doctor's advice to stop speaking in public after she'd had a stroke. A biography, shortly to be published by her former advisor Robin Harris, claimed there were arguments with her husband Dennis, who found her failing memory and repetitiveness difficult to deal with. But when he died in 2003, she was bereft. A small band of friends rallied round, knowing the void he left in her life.
Dennis was completely in Margaret's life, and Margaret required Dennis to be there to discuss all decisions, all promotions, all sackings. All of those things were always discussed with Dennis. Whether she followed Dennis's view or not is an altogether different argument. She experienced a massive loss when Dennis died. He had been part of her life forever. She was very lonely. She couldn't really come to terms, and it took some time for her to remember that he was dead. She would forget all the time. And I think it was a bigger loss to her than almost anything else.
She also had to suffer her son Mark being arrested in South Africa for suspected involvement in an attempted coup in Equatorial Guinea. He was subsequently released, but his marriage failed and she rarely saw the grandchildren who lived abroad. Mark had always been her favourite, but to the surprise of her friends, she was much cheered by her daughter Carol's successful appearance on the TV show I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here.
Thought that she wouldn't have the faintest idea what was going on. She absolutely watched the programme. She was fascinated by it. She thought Carol did a fantastic job. And she was thrilled when she won and said, typical Thatcher. Typical Thatcher, she's won.
By then, she was often confused, but that didn't stop Gordon Brown asking her to Downing Street in 2007.
Thatcher, can we do a picture on the doorstep, please? Prime Minister?
This was supposedly a private meeting, but the media were there in force as Lady Thatcher, dressed in striking pink, arrived in Downing Street.
In dinners and receptions and so on, until very, very recently, she still had very firm views. And the thing I always say about her, although impaired by memory and frustrated by increased frailty, her instincts were in full working order right to the end. If you told her something that had happened, you would get an authentic Thatcher response. After the 2010 election, she expressed an interest in meeting some of the new parliamentary party, and she was so touched that almost all of those that we met at these little receptions had come into politics because of her. And one colleague said to her, of course, we're in coalition with the Liberal Democrats now. And she raised her index finger at him and said, I am not in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. Instincts in full working order. Fascinated by what was going on, talked about the opinion polls and the fact that we were 9% behind, and she asked me when the next election was, and I said it wasn't for a couple of years, and she expressed the view that 9% behind wasn't far enough behind at this point in the cycle. I certainly didn't expect that